Hello, welcome back to Theater Journal Shorts. I'm here today with Dr. Sara Sanchez-Zweig to discuss her article, In a Trance, Cora Hatch and the Spiritualist Trance-Lecture, which is out in our September 2025 special issue of Theater Journal on Magic. That's Volume 77, Issue 3. Hello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you.
So I'm really excited to delve into your article for the upcoming issue of Theater Journal. I was wondering if you could start off by giving our viewers a brief summary of the topic of your article and your main argument in it.
Okay, great. My article's about the life and career of Cora Hatch, who was a US American spiritualist medium, performer, activist. She was active from the 1850s all the way up to the end of her life in 1923. And so she was active in the spiritualist movement, which is like a specific religious movement that became very popular shortly before and after the Civil War. And they believe three things. Number one is that the spirit lives on after death. Number two is that the spirits can and like actively want to communicate with us, and that the spirit also like continues to improve and better itself even in the afterlife. And so Cora became a big figure in this movement, and like many spiritualists, she started when she was a young girl. She started as a medium, and so by the time she became a teenager, already like late in her teenage years, she was already like very well known. She was something of a celebrity, especially in the Northeast, and like lots of audiences came to her lectures, and there was a lot of press coverage. And she was specifically known for her trance lectures. So what she would do would be she's booking large lecture halls and inviting the community to come see. And often she would ask local committees to pick a topic for her to deliver a lecture on. And usually the topics were things that a young woman like her probably wouldn't be expected to know, right? So like things like new developments in medicine or like political strategy or like religious history. And so she'd get up on stage, she'd get the topic, she'd say a short prayer first, and then she'd go into a trance and she'd channel the spirit of someone who was an expert on the topic, and she'd deliver a lecture through like as that spirit. And so she became very popular doing that. There was lots of like debate around whether what she was doing was real or not. Other times she would deliver lectures that were channeling the spirit of someone famous from American history, usually. So she would do like Ben Franklin or some in Philadelphia, or like Patrick Henry or Andrew Jackson at one point. Um, and and yeah, she became really popular doing these things. But as she grew older, she became more politically involved, and she became something of a leader in her own right. And I dedicate a section of my article to one trance lecture that she delivered, um, channeling the spirit of Abraham Lincoln in 1910 in Chicago. Um, and I find her just a really fascinating figure because she's doing so much on stage with just her presence, right? It's just her on stage saying words and channeling spirits. And a lot of spiritualists did very like spectacular things, like they'd manifest ghosts or like pull ectoplasm out of their mouths and stuff like that. But she was actually it's just her body on stage delivering messages from like some of the most important people in American history. And so my argument is that these trance lectures really highlight the ways that performance mobilizes and structures our fantasies around gender and race, but also around national identity. And I imagine that these audiences really have a desire to like identify with some kind of progressive message or some kind of national identity that gets reflected back to them during this time of like real uncertainty and like national turmoil. And I think that the trance lecture shows how powerful that desire can be. The fact that so many people were able to see Cora and hear Cora, but also like hear and see something like Abraham Lincoln at the same time.
That's really fascinating. I'm glad you mentioned gender when you were talking about your argument, because that was the first thing that popped into my head when you said things that a person like her wouldn't have been expected to know. There are so many assumptions baked into that about what a youngish woman should or would know at that time. I'm also, of course, thinking about like, are chatbots the current day trans medium, kind of like reflecting ourselves back?
I have a friend who researches that. Who researches
Fantastic.
like AI and like communications with spirits and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that to be one of the most fascinating instances of AI, but I am digressing from your article topic. Could you tell our viewers how you came to this topic? How did you find out about Cora Hatch and her performances?
I was developing a dissertation on stage magic, and I was interested in, the history of stage magic and stage magicians and what they could teach us about theater and live performance. Um, and I was developing like orals reading lists on this, and it was just a kind of weird out of the blue topic for me. And a lot of these stage magicians were also big debunkers, and they would go around challenging spirit mediums and like exposing their methods and stuff. And so I decided to read a little bit about spirit mediums, and I stumbled on Cora Hatch as like one of these main figures in American spiritualism. And I just kind of fell in love with what she was doing. And in a way, she was answering the question that I originally had about stage magic, which is like, how are they using the restrictions of live performance to also do something really impressive and spectacular. Um, and yeah, and I think she just really embraces everything that we love about performance. There's something obviously like mystifying and magical happening, but there's also a way that she's like providing audiences with a connection to their own cultural and historical moment. So I'm hoping to develop that into its own project now, alongside the stage magic stuff.
Yeah, which also sounds fascinating. Could you talk a little bit more about how this fits into that broader research on stage magic, or maybe, reaching beyond to theater and performance studies more generally, some of the current conversations that are going on in the field?
Yeah, I mean this I think I'm ultimately going to separate stage magicians from spiritualists, because I think I'm asking different questions ultimately, and they're kind of operating on different like uh cognitive epistemological frameworks, right? But I one thing about I think I'm making an intervention into like ideas about spiritualism, because there's been two main ways of thinking about spiritualism, and both of them have a sort of like moral thrust, right? So like the first one is that these are predatory and like delusional performers, right? And they're often women who are taking advantage of like people who are grieving, right? The second one is kind of like going the opposite direction and saying, well, actually, these women are like doing the best they can in a patriarchal society, and they're using spiritualism to like assert their own voices and to be politically active and to like earn an income. And I think my approach is like trying to avoid either one of those um, paths, and I want to put aside the question of whether they're like true or false or good or bad, and instead think about like what are they performing and constructing with their audiences. So I'm trying to think with other scholarship about like what does performance represent. Like I'm thinking less about what performance represents and more about what it does. And so how does Cora establish a relationship with her audience? How is she using her body, her femininity, her voice, her words, her context? Like what desires is she tapping into? How is she mobilizing folks in a political way, but also in an emotional and effective way? Um, and what do people take away from her lecture? Like, how are they transformed or changed through her lecture? Even folks who might not even believe that she's actually channeling a spirit. Um, so yeah, so I think my article is really trying to get at the advantage of a performance studies lens. Um,
Hmm.
but it's also, I think I'm also doing a kind of like reverse action too, where I'm also thinking like, okay, well, not only can like what does spiritualism learn from performance studies, but also what can performance studies learn from spiritualism? And I think it's that like a lot of performance is something like a trance lecture in that it's mobilizing our desire, it's tapping into our fantasies, and we're often like having these magical experiences and mystifying experiences um in the way that performance does like mobilize and connect with us.
Think that's really interesting because it's getting at sort of like what are the boundaries of belief in the theater too, and what can we do beyond really tired cliches of the kind of idea of suspension of disbelief, right? There's obviously so much more that can go on in the encounter between audiences and any kind of live performance. So I think that's really interesting. And I hope this will be a fascinating topic and also have a lot of really important takeaways for any undergraduates who might be watching this and reading your article alongside it. So for those viewers in particular, what would you say are some of the key things you'd like them to take away from this, reading your article and understanding a little bit more about Cora Hatch and spiritualism?
I hope that one thing students get from this is thinking about performance more broadly, right, in other cultural settings besides just, theater. um, and uh, and I also hope they can use it as something of a case study to think about the way that gender and performance work, um, and and to think about how do we perform identity, how do we perform nationhood, how do we perform history, right? What is the point of like reviving Abraham Lincoln to tell us what to do in 1910? And how does this like new lecture also kind of help us reflect on where we've come from and who we want to be? uh and so yeah, I hope that students can use it as a model of thinking about how we construct ourselves through performance.
That's great. Is there anything else you'd like to add for our viewers before we wrap up?
No, I think we're good.
Well, thank you again so much for taking the time today to talk with us. For our viewers, I'm here today with Dr. Sara Sanchez-Zweig, and she's been discussing her article, In a Trance, Cora Hatch and the Spiritualist Trance-Lecture, which is coming out in Volume 77, Issue 3 of Theater Journal in September 2025. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks.